Learning is broken. Let me tell you something that every teacher, every professor, every so-called educational expert has gotten catastrophically, embarrassingly wrong. They told you learning is hard. They told you some people are naturally smart and some aren't. They handed you textbooks the size of bricks, filled your head with formulas you'd forget by Thursday, and then had the audacity to call that education. I spent my entire life watching brilliant people fail to learn. And I spent that same life watching people, everyone had written off people told they were not smart enough, suddenly explode with understanding when someone showed them the right way in. Here's what nobody tells you. Your brain is not the problem. The method is the problem. I discovered something not by accident, not by luck, but by obsessively studying how understanding actually works. A technique so simple, so devastatingly effective, that it will make everything you've been doing in school or work feel like trying to fill a bathtub with the drain open. You've been learning wrong your entire life. And in the next hour, I'm going to show you exactly how to learn right. Buckle up, because nothing about this is going to feel comfortable. The intelligence myth, why people quit. I want to start with a confession. When I was in school, a young kid in Far Rockaway, Queens, New York, I was not considered exceptional. I was curious, yes. I asked too many questions, yes. I drove my teachers slightly crazy, absolutely yes. But nobody looked at young Richard Feynman and said, there goes a future Nobel laureate. Nobody. And you know what? That's the most important thing I could possibly tell you before we get into everything else. Because the story that society tells about intelligence, about learning, about who gets to understand difficult things and who doesn't, is one of the most destructive, damaging, flat-out wrong stories that has ever been told to human beings. Let me be very direct with you. I'm going to say something that contradicts almost everything you've been taught since kindergarten. Intelligence is not a fixed thing. It is a skill. And like every skill, it can be developed, trained, and dramatically improved. Not slightly improved, not marginally tweaked, dramatically transformed. Here's how the lie works. A child sits in a classroom. The teacher explains something, let's say long division. Most of the class gets it reasonably quickly, but 3 kids in the back are struggling. They're confused. They're lost. And what happens? The teacher moves on. The curriculum demands it. And those 3 kids who maybe just needed a different explanation, a different angle, a different way, and get left behind, they start to form a belief about themselves. I'm not a math person. Science isn't for me. I'm just not smart enough for this. And here is where the real damage happens. Because once a human being forms that belief, once they genuinely, deeply, emotionally believe that they are fundamentally incapable of understanding something, they stop trying. Not because they're lazy, not because they're weak, but because the brain is extraordinarily efficient at not wasting energy on things it believes are impossible. Why would you spend hours studying physics if you know deep in your bones with complete certainty that you're not a physics person? You wouldn't. Nobody would. And so the belief becomes self-fulfilling. The kid who was told they weren't a math person grows into an adult who can't balance a checkbook, who says, oh, I was never good at numbers at dinner parties, who passes that exact same limiting belief onto their own children. The lie reproduces itself, generation after generation. Training versus real learning. What school actually measures. Now, I want to be careful here, because I'm not saying schools are evil. I'm not saying teachers are villains. Most teachers I've known were genuinely dedicated people doing their best within a system that was designed for a completely different purpose than actual learning. The school system, the standardized tests, the letter grades, the curriculum was designed historically to produce compliant workers. People who could follow instructions, memorize procedures, show up on time, and perform predictable tasks reliably. That's not learning, that's training. There's a profound difference between training and learning, and most people have spent their entire educational careers doing the first while believing they were doing the second. Training is when you repeat something until you can reproduce it mechanically. You memorize the formula, you practice the procedure, you pass the test. And then be honest with yourself, you forget 70% of it within 3 months. Learning is something entirely different. Learning is when you understand something so deeply that you could explain it fresh, from scratch, in your own words, to anyone, even if you'd never seen that specific form of the question before. Let me give you an example from my own experience. When I was at MIT, I noticed something troubling. My classmates could solve physics problems from the textbook with impressive speed. Give them a problem that looked like the examples, same structure, same type of equation, and they'd nail it. Perfect. But change the framing. Present the same underlying physics in an unfamiliar context. Ask them to apply the same principle to something they hadn't seen before. And suddenly, many of them were completely lost. They'd been trained. They had not learned. I made a decision very early that I would never move on from a topic until I could feel it in my bones, until I could walk away from the textbook, sit quietly, and reconstruct the entire chain of reasoning from fundamental principles without looking at a single note. That decision changed everything. What intelligence actually is. So if intelligence isn't this fixed, inherited, you either have it or you don't. Quality, what actually is it? Here's my answer, developed over decades of teaching, learning, and thinking about thinking. Intelligence is the quality of the connections between ideas in your mind. That's it. That's the whole secret. When you understand something deeply, truly understand it, not just memorize it, your brain builds physical connections between that idea and other ideas you already know. Neurons wire together. Pathways form. The more connections you have, the more entry points into your knowledge, the easier it becomes to retrieve, apply, and extend that knowledge to new situations. A person who seems brilliant at mathematics isn't necessarily someone with a bigger brain or more neurons. There's someone who has built a dense, richly connected network of mathematical understanding. When they encounter a new problem, they have 1,000 pathways to try. They can approach from different angles. They can see the underlying structure through different lenses. A person who is bad at math often just has a sparse, poorly connected network. They've memorized some procedures, but they're not connected to anything. They're floating, isolated, without context. One new wrinkle in the problem, and the whole thing collapses. The question then is not, am I smart enough to learn this? The question is, how do I build better connections? How learning works in the brain, the neuroscience of learning. Let me bring in some actual science here, because I think it's important to understand why these things work, not just that they work. Physics is more satisfying when you understand the mechanism, not just the outcome. The same is true of learning. Your brain has approximately 86 billion neurons. Each neuron can form connections, synapses, with thousands of other neurons. The total number of possible connections in a single human brain is greater than the number of atoms in the known universe. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Your skull contains more potential complexity than the cosmos. Now, how do those connections form? Through a process called synaptic plasticity. When neurons fire together repeatedly, the connection between them strengthens. This is often summarized as neurons that fire together, wire together. The more often you activate a particular pattern of neural firing, the stronger and faster that pathway becomes. This is why repetition helps learning, but only the right kind of repetition. Mindless repetition, where you're running through material on autopilot, strengthens connections minimally. Active, effortful, struggling repetition, where your brain is genuinely working to retrieve and reconstruct, strengthens connections dramatically. There's also something called myelin. Myelin is a fatty sheath that wraps around frequently used neural pathways, making signal transmission faster and more reliable. The more you practice something correctly, the more myelin builds up on those pathways. World-class performers in any field, musicians, athletes, mathematicians, have extraordinarily myelinated pathways in their areas of expertise. But here's what's critical. Myelin builds from practice, not from passive exposure. Reading about playing piano doesn't myelinate your motor pathways. Playing piano does. Reading about calculus doesn't build mathematical neural networks. Working through calculus problems, struggling with them, making mistakes, correcting them does. This is why passive learning, sitting in a lecture, reading a textbook, watching videos, is so spectacularly inefficient compared to active learning. Your brain is not a recording device. It is not a sponge. It is a pattern recognition and connection building machine. And it only does its best work when it is actively engaged. The generation effect. Here's one of my favorite findings from cognitive psychology, something I discovered empirically long before the formal research confirmed it. It's called the generation effect. And the basic finding is this. Information that you generate yourself, that you produce, reconstruct, create, is retained dramatically better than information that is simply presented to you. When you read the answer to a question, your brain logs it superficially. When you struggle to generate the answer yourself, even if you get it wrong, your brain goes through a much deeper encoding process. The struggle itself is the learning. This is counterintuitive. It feels like it should be easier to learn when someone tells you the answer. It feels like struggling is inefficient, like a waste of time. But the feeling is wrong. The struggle is the point. The difficulty is the mechanism. This is why my approach to learning was always to close the book as early as possible and try to reconstruct what I just read from memory. Not because I had a photographic memory, I didn't, but because the act of reconstruction, of generation, of forcing my brain to produce what it had just absorbed, that's what built the real understanding. So here we are. Before I've even introduced you to the specific technique, the method that people call the Feynman Technique, I want you to have the foundation clear in your mind. Learning is a physical process. It involves real biological changes in your brain. Those changes happen through active engagement, through struggle, through connection building, through generation. Intelligence is not fixed. It is the current state of your neural connections. And neural connections can always be built, strengthened, and expanded. The school system, for the most part, does not teach you how to learn. It teaches you what to learn, and even then, it mostly teaches you how to temporarily store information long enough to reproduce it on a test. Real learning, the kind that sticks, the kind that transfers, the kind that lets you walk into any situation and figure out what's happening, requires a fundamentally different approach. This is not a self-help gimmick. This is not a productivity hack. This is the actual structure of how deep understanding forms in a human mind. And once you see it, once you really see it, you will never be able to go back to the old way. Because the old way, you will realize, was never really learning at all. The Feynman Technique, 4 steps. All right, let's get into the actual mechanics. I want to start with a story because stories, I've always believed, are how the brain most naturally organizes information. A good story is a delivery vehicle for ideas that bypasses all the usual resistance and goes straight to the understanding center. When I was at Cornell, teaching my first physics courses after the war, I noticed something that deeply troubled me. My students were brilliant people. They'd gotten into Cornell, for heaven's sake. They'd passed every exam, every prerequisite, every filter the academic system had put in front of them. And yet, when I asked them questions slightly outside the standard format, when I pushed them to explain why the equations were what they were, not just what the equations produced, I was met with blank stares. Uncomfortable shifting in seats. Memorized phrases that, when I probed them, turned out to be completely hollow. These students knew the words of physics. They did not know physics. It was like someone who had memorized the dictionary definition of swimming, but had never been in water. They could talk about swimming with impressive technical vocabulary, but if you threw them in the deep end, they would drown. I became obsessed with fixing this, not just for my students, but because I genuinely believed that the inability to learn deeply was one of the greatest wastes of human potential I had ever witnessed. So I developed a method. Step 1, choose your concept and study it. This sounds obvious. It is not obvious. There is a very specific way to do this first step that most people get completely wrong. Pick one concept, not a chapter, not a subject, one specific concept. The photoelectric effect, supply and demand curves, how DNA replication works, the specific mechanism by which antibiotics kill bacteria. One thing. Now study it. But study it with a specific goal in mind, a goal that is fundamentally different from learning it for the test. Your goal is this: understand it well enough to explain it to someone who has never encountered it before. That is your target. Keep that target in front of you the entire time you're reading, watching, taking notes. Not understand it well enough to answer these specific practice questions. Not understand it well enough to get through the exam. Understand it well enough to teach it to a stranger. This shift in goal completely changes how you engage with the material. When you read for the exam, you're looking for things that might be tested. When you read to teach, you're looking for the core idea, the essential engine at the center of the concept, and you're building a mental model that is coherent enough to transmit to another mind. Take notes. But here's the crucial detail. Take notes in your own words, not the author's words, not the textbook's words, your words. If you can't say it in your own words, you don't understand it yet. You've just memorized the phrasing. Step 2, teach it to a child. Now, close the book, close all your notes. and explain the concept out loud as if you were teaching it to a 12-year-old who has no background knowledge. And I mean genuinely do this. Get a piece of paper, write at the top, what I'm going to explain today is, and then explain it from the beginning in the simplest, most direct language you can manage. No jargon, no technical terms hiding behind other technical terms, no retreating into the safety of complicated vocabulary that sounds like understanding but isn't. Here's why this step is so devastatingly effective. Jargon is where ignorance hides. Technical vocabulary serves a legitimate purpose. It lets experts communicate precisely and efficiently with each other. But it is also the most convenient hiding place for confusion in the universe. When you say the quantum wave function collapses upon measurement, you sound like you know what you're talking about. But do you? Do you really know what that means? In plain language, in terms of what is actually physically happening. Most people don't, and they never discover that they don't, because they keep talking to other people who also just know the words. The child test exposes this immediately. Try explaining wave function collapse to a 12-year-old without using quantum wave function or measurement as undefined terms. Go on, I'll wait. It's hard, isn't it? That difficulty is extremely valuable information. It's telling you exactly where your understanding breaks down. Feynman's rule of thumb: if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it yet. Not you haven't explained it simply, you don't understand it. Because genuine understanding always generates the ability to simplify. Step 3, identify the gaps and go back as you're doing. Step 2, as you're trying to explain the concept in simple terms, you will inevitably hit moments where you stumble, where you say something vague, where you realize you're using a word you can't actually define, where the chain of reasoning suddenly has a missing link you didn't know was missing. These moments are gold. Most learners experience these moments and feel embarrassed. They feel like they've exposed their own stupidity. They want to cover the gap with more jargon and move on. Don't. Resist that impulse with everything you have. Instead, write down exactly where you got confused, exactly what term you couldn't define, exactly where the logical chain broke down. Be specific. I don't really understand why the electron repels the other electron. I know it does, but I don't know why. Write that down. Then go back to the source material, not to read the whole thing again. Go back specifically to address the gaps you just identified. This targeted return, this precision gap filling, is dramatically more effective than general rereading because your brain now has a specific question it's trying to answer. And a brain with a question is a brain that is genuinely actively processing. Repeat the child explanation. Fill in the new understanding. Find the next gap. Return to the source. This cycle, explain, find gap, fill gap, explain again, is the actual engine of deep learning. Step 4, simplify and use analogy. The final step is about crystallization. You've understood the concept. You can explain it in simple terms. Now make it unforgettable. Find an analogy, find a metaphor, find a connection to something the imaginary child already knows. This is not a dumbing down. This is the highest form of understanding. Creating a good analogy for a complex concept requires you to understand it so thoroughly that you can identify its essential structural features, the features that are preserved in the simpler comparison. When I wanted to understand electricity, I didn't just memorize Ohm's law. I built analogies. Voltage is like water pressure. Current is like the flow rate of water. Resistance is like the diameter of the pipe. These analogies are imperfect. All analogies are, but they gave me a handle on the concept. An entry point, a place to hook new understanding. When I was teaching quantum electrodynamics, I developed entirely new ways of visualizing the mathematics, Feynman diagrams specifically, because I believed that if you couldn't see it, you didn't really understand it. The mathematics was the precision. The diagram was the understanding. Find your diagram. Find your analogy. Find the story that carries the idea. Why schools kill learning. Now, I want to say something that is going to make some people uncomfortable. Good. Discomfort is a sign that you're actually thinking. The modern school system, as it is designed and operated in most of the world, is not optimized for learning. It is optimized for something else entirely. And in the process of optimizing for that something else, it actively, systematically, and quite thoroughly damages the natural human capacity for deep learning. Let me explain exactly how. The pace problem: school moves at a fixed pace. The curriculum must be covered by a certain date. The test is on Friday, regardless of whether you've understood Tuesday's material. But understanding does not respect schedules. Some concepts click in 10 minutes. Others require 3 weeks of wrestling before they suddenly become clear. The moment you force learning into rigid time boxes, you guarantee that a significant portion of students will be moved on before they've understood, building their subsequent understanding on a foundation of sand. Algebra is built on arithmetic. Calculus is built on algebra. Physics is built on calculus. Chemistry is built on physics. If the foundation is shaky, if the earlier concepts weren't truly understood, every subsequent layer is compromised. I've seen graduate students in physics who had fundamental misconceptions about basic Newtonian mechanics, not because they were unintelligent, because they were moved through the curriculum before the foundation had set. The testing illusion: tests measure performance at a specific moment on specific types of questions. They do not measure understanding. They do not measure the ability to transfer knowledge. They do not measure genuine comprehension. But because tests are the primary feedback mechanism in schools, students optimize for tests. They learn test-taking strategies. They identify which topics are likely to appear and study those. They learn the specific phrasing that gets points. And they mistake test performance for learning. The grade arrives. It says A. The student feels they have learned the material, and perhaps they have for that specific test, in that specific format, on that specific day. Ask them the same underlying questions 3 months later, framed differently, and watch how much of material evaporates. This is what psychologists call the illusion of knowing, and it is one of the most dangerous phenomena in education, because a student who knows they don't understand something will seek to fix it. A student who incorrectly believes they understand something will not. The extrinsic motivation trap here is perhaps the deepest damage that conventional schooling does. Humans are born with an extraordinary natural drive to learn. Watch a 2-year-old encounter a new object. Watch the intensity of their focus. Watch them explore, test, experiment, taste, throw, examine. The natural human learning drive is one of the most powerful motivational forces in biology. Then we put children in schools. We tell them what to learn. We tell them when to learn it. We grade them on it. We reward them if they comply and punish them if they don't. We replace their intrinsic curiosity with external carrots and sticks. And something terrible happens. Research on motivation, particularly the work on what psychologists call cognitive evaluation theory, consistently shows that introducing extrinsic rewards for activities that were previously intrinsically motivating reduces the intrinsic motivation. The activity shifts from something you do because you love it to something you do for the reward. And when the reward disappears, when school is over, when the grade no longer matters, the motivation goes with it. This is why so many adults who are perfectly curious children feel no drive to learn new things. Schools systematically replace their love of learning with a learned helplessness, a sense that learning is something that happens to you in institutions, on schedules, under compulsion. I was lucky. I had a father, Melville Feynman, who gave me my love of learning before school had a chance to damage it. He took me to the woods. He showed me birds. He taught me to ask why. He made curiosity feel like an adventure rather than an obligation. Not everyone is so fortunate. But the damage is not permanent. The natural curiosity is not destroyed. It is buried. And in part 3, I'm going to show you exactly how to dig it back up. The curiosity engine plus deep work. I want to tell you about the day I decided to learn how to draw. I was well into my physics career, Nobel Prize already in the rearview mirror, and I decided completely on a whim, completely without any practical justification, that I wanted to become a decent artist. People thought I was crazy. Physicists don't just decide to learn art. There's a whole system that's supposed to happen. Art school, years of formal training, natural talent spotted in childhood. You can't just pick it up. I picked it up, not because I had any special artistic gift. I didn't. My first drawings were genuinely terrible, but I was curious. I wanted to understand how drawing worked, what the principles were, how the eye perceives form, how lines on paper create the illusion of 3 dimensions. I approached it the same way I approached physics, with genuine, burning, delighted curiosity about the underlying mechanism. Within a few years, I was selling drawings and paintings. I exhibited my work, and I learned more about visual perception from that process than I could have from any psychology textbook. The point of the story is not that I'm talented. The point is that curiosity is a skill, not a trait, and it can be deliberately cultivated. The curiosity engine Most people think of curiosity as something that happens to you. You're curious about something or you're not. It's beyond your control, like eye color or height. This is wrong, and I can prove it's wrong with a simple thought experiment. Think of a topic you currently find completely boring: accounting, medieval French poetry, the chemical properties of industrial lubricants. Whatever, pick something that makes your eyes glaze over. Now, what if I told you that inside that boring topic there was a mystery that directly affected your life? That the outcome of understanding it would change something you care deeply about? That there was a hidden connection between that topic and something you already love? Would you still be bored? Of course not, because curiosity is not about topics. Curiosity is about perceived relevance and perceived mystery. It's a response to a gap between what you know and what you want to know. And that gap can be created deliberately about almost any subject. Here's how I do it. Here's the technique I use to make myself curious about anything I need to learn. I start with the most interesting question in the field, not the most fundamental one. Traditional education works from the ground up. First you learn the basic definitions, then the basic principles, then the applications. Finally, if you get that far, you encounter the interesting questions, the mysteries, the open problems, the things that make the field genuinely exciting. I work from the top down. I start with the most fascinating, most mysterious, most jaw-dropping aspect of the subject. Why does quantum mechanics make predictions so accurate they've been verified to 1 part in a billion, but we have absolutely no idea why it works? Now, I'm curious about quantum mechanics. Now I want to learn the foundations, because I'm trying to solve a mystery, not complete a checklist. The order matters enormously. Lead with wonder. The details will follow, because you'll want them to follow. There's another dimension to this that I think is underappreciated to a criminal degree. Play. Real play. The kind of purposeless, self-directed, intrinsically motivated exploration that children do and adults are told to stop doing. Some of my most productive scientific work came not from grinding through problems because they were important, but from playing with things that interested me purely for the pleasure of it. After I won the Nobel Prize in 1965 for work on quantum electrodynamics that I did largely because I was having fun thinking about electrons, someone asked me how I had managed to solve problems that the best physicists in the world had been stuck on. My honest answer was, I wasn't trying to solve the world's hardest problems. I was playing. I was sitting in the cafeteria at Cornell, watching a plate someone had thrown wobbling through the air and wondering about the ratio of its rotation rate to its wobble. Not because it was important, because it was interesting, because I was curious. That playful calculation led directly through a chain of connections I couldn't have predicted to the work that eventually won me the Nobel Prize. Play is not the opposite of learning. Play is the most powerful form of learning that exists. Deep work versus shallow studying. Now let's talk about time, because this is where most people make their biggest practical mistake. When students tell me they're struggling to learn something, my first question is never, are you smart enough? My first question is, what does your studying actually look like? And invariably, what they describe is something like this: 3 hours in the library, textbook open, phone on the table, a playlist playing, notes being copied from book to paper, friends stopping by for brief conversations, highlights being added to pages already thoroughly highlighted. This is not studying. This is the appearance of studying. This is what studying looks like from the outside. From the inside, what's happening is that the brain is in a shallow, distracted, partially engaged state that is producing almost no real learning. The term deep work, which the writer Cal Newport has written about extensively, captures something I practiced intuitively throughout my entire career. It refers to cognitive work performed in a state of intense, undistracted focus, where you're operating at the absolute limits of your concentration and understanding. And here is the brutal truth about deep work. 1 hour of genuine deep work produces more learning than 5 hours of shallow, distracted studying. This is not an exaggeration. It is consistently supported by research on learning and cognitive performance. The brain's ability to encode information deeply, to build strong neural connections, to do the real metabolic work of learning all of it, requires concentrated, undistracted focus. Multitasking doesn't divide your attention, it destroys your attention. When you switch between tasks, there's a cognitive cost called attention residue. Part of your mind is still on the previous task. Part is on the current task. Part is monitoring the phone for notifications. None of it is fully engaged. And shallow engagement produces shallow learning. How to create genuine, deep work. So how do you actually achieve this state? Here's what worked for me, and what I've observed working for the most effective learners I've ever encountered. First, time blocking with hard boundaries. Choose a specific block of time for learning. Not this afternoon. Specific, 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. Mark it, protect it. During that time, the phone does not exist. The internet does not exist. The only thing that exists is you and the material. Start with blocks of 90 minutes. That's roughly the length of a natural human ultradian rhythm, the cycle of high focus followed by rest that runs through our biology. 90 minutes of true focus, followed by a genuine break, not a check the phone break, not a quick email break, a real break, walk, sit quietly, let the mind wander. Second, the minimum viable environment. Studying in a loud, stimulating, visually busy environment is an obstacle you are placing in your own path. The brain's prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for focused, effortful cognitive work, is easily overwhelmed by competing stimulation. Every interesting thing in your environment is pulling small amounts of attention from your work. Find the most boring, least stimulating environment available. I know it feels like you need music or background noise to focus. Research consistently shows this is a feeling, not a fact. Most people learn better in silence. The music feels comfortable because it's familiar. It doesn't actually help. Third, the active engagement requirement. I cannot emphasize this enough. Passive rereading is essentially useless. Copying notes is essentially useless. Highlighting is essentially useless. What works? Testing yourself. Generating the information from memory. Solving problems without looking at the solutions first. Explaining concepts out loud. Drawing diagrams without reference. These are effortful. They're uncomfortable. Your brain resists them, and they are exactly 10 times more effective than passive review. How to learn anything in record time. Let me now give you a complete system, a step-by-step protocol that I've distilled from everything we've discussed that you can apply to literally any subject you want to learn. Phase 1, the overview, day 1 to 2 hours. Get a bird's eye view of the entire subject before you drill into any specifics. This seems counterintuitive. Shouldn't you start from the beginning? No. The overview gives your brain a map. It shows the territory before you start navigating. It tells your brain where each piece of information belongs before the pieces arrive. Read the table of contents of several books on the subject. Read Wikipedia's overview. Watch one high-quality survey lecture. Your goal is not to understand everything, it's to get a rough sense of the shape of the knowledge. Phase 2, the curiosity ignition, day 1 to 2. Now do what I described earlier. Find the most fascinating mystery or application in the field. The thing that makes experts in the field excited. The open question. The counterintuitive result. The application that seems like magic. Let this ignite your curiosity before you get into the grind. Because the grind will come, and when it does, you need fuel. The mystery is your fuel. Phase 3, Feynman cycles, days 2 to 14. Work through the material in chunks, applying the 4-step Feynman technique to each concept. Study, teach to a child. Find gaps, fill gaps. Study, teach to a child. Repeat. Don't move to the next concept until you can explain the current one clearly, simply, and with a good analogy. Even if it takes 3 days, even if the curriculum says you should be 3 chapters ahead, depth beats breadth. Every single time. Phase 4, spaced repetition, ongoing. Once you've understood a concept, use spaced repetition to ensure it stays in long-term memory. The spacing effect is one of the most robust findings in cognitive psychology, reviewing material at increasing intervals. 1 day, 3 days, 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month is dramatically more effective at building permanent memory than concentrated review. Tools like Anki, a spaced repetition flashcard system, can automate this for fact-based content. For conceptual understanding, periodic teach-it-to-a-child sessions serve the same purpose. Phase 5, application and connection, weeks 2 to 4. The final phase, and this is what separates real learning from exam cramming, is application. Use what you've learned. Solve novel problems. Find connections to other things you know. Teach it to actual humans. The connections are everything. The more you link your new understanding to existing knowledge, to real situations, to other fields, the more permanent and flexible that knowledge becomes. The time reality check. Let me be honest with you about time, because I think there's a destructive myth about rapid learning that I want to address directly. Deep understanding of a complex subject takes time. It takes sustained effort. Anyone who tells you they can teach you calculus in a weekend or quantum mechanics in 10 videos is selling you something, what I've described, the Feynman Technique. Deep work, spaced repetition doesn't make learning effortless. It makes it efficient. It ensures that the time you invest produces real, lasting, transferable understanding instead of temporary, fragile, exam-passing familiarity. The difference is this. With standard studying methods, 100 hours might produce knowledge that fades within 6 months. With the method I've described, 40 hours might produce knowledge that stays with you for life. That's not magic. That's just doing it right. The illusion of competence. I've spent 3 parts of this series building up a complete architecture of how learning works, why it fails, and how to fix it. And everything I've told you is true. The Feynman Technique works. Deep work works. Spaced repetition works. Curiosity ignition works. But there is one more thing, one more factor that I have deliberately saved for the end, because I think it is the most important of everything, and I wanted to build to it properly. There is an enemy of learning that is so common, so pervasive, so deeply embedded in how most people think and operate, that it flies completely beneath the radar. Nobody names it. Nobody teaches you to watch out for it. And yet it destroys more human learning potential than any other single factor I can identify. Its name is the illusion of competence, and it is absolutely everywhere. Here is how it works. You sit down to study, you open the textbook, you read through the chapter. The material makes sense as you read it. You nod along. You feel the understanding arriving. You finish the chapter feeling solid, feeling like you've got it. Then you close the book, and without the book in front of you, you discover that you cannot reconstruct what you just read. You can't remember the key points. You can't explain the mechanism. The understanding that felt so solid while you were reading has evaporated. This is the illusion of competence, and it is one of the most psychologically convincing experiences in existence. It feels like understanding. It has the texture of understanding. But it is not understanding. It is the feeling you get when you're reading something that makes sense to you as you read it, which is a completely different cognitive experience from actually knowing something. Reading something that is well written and logically presented produces a feeling of understanding almost automatically, regardless of whether any real encoding is taking place. The material flows. It connects. You follow along. You think you're learning. But following an argument is not the same as understanding it at the level where you can reproduce and apply it. Following an argument is a passive experience. Understanding is an active one. Why this is so dangerous? The reason this illusion is so particularly dangerous is that it prevents people from taking the actions that would produce real learning. If you finish a chapter and feel like you understand it, you don't go back and test yourself. You don't close the book and try to reconstruct it. You move on because it feels like you've got it. But you don't have it. You have the feeling of having it. And that feeling, without the accompanying genuine understanding, is worse than knowing nothing. Because if you know you don't understand something, you'll work to fix it. If you falsely believe you understand it, you won't. I developed a personal rule early in my career that I've never broken. I do not trust the feeling of understanding. I only trust the demonstration of understanding. Every time I finished reading something significant, before I allowed myself to feel confident about it, I had to pass my own test. Close the material, explain it from scratch, find the gaps. If I couldn't demonstrate the understanding, I didn't have it, regardless of how solid it felt while I was reading. This habit was sometimes humbling. You'd think you understood something beautifully, close the book, start explaining, and hit a wall almost immediately. The feeling of understanding was there. The understanding itself was not. But over time, this discipline transformed my learning. Because every time I closed the book and tested myself, I got accurate feedback. Not the comfortable, misleading feedback of this makes sense as I read it, but the brutally honest feedback of here is exactly where my understanding stops. The ego problem. There is another enemy of learning that is closely related to the illusion of competence, and it's one that particularly affects intelligent people, which makes it particularly pernicious. Ego. The need to appear competent. The fear of appearing stupid. The avoidance of situations where you might be exposed as not knowing something. I've watched incredibly intelligent people fail to learn things because they were too proud to ask basic questions, too proud to admit confusion, too proud to say the most important 3 words in the vocabulary of any genuine learner: I don't understand. This is not a trivial problem. It is a deeply human one. We are social creatures. Status matters to us, and admitting ignorance feels like a status loss. But here is what I've come to believe after a lifetime of learning. The willingness to be confused, to sit in confusion, to admit it freely, to pursue the resolution of it relentlessly, is not a sign of weakness. It is the fundamental prerequisite for intelligence. Every time I walked into a new field, every time I picked up a new subject, whether it was biology or art or safe cracking or bongo drumming, I walked in as a complete beginner, happy to be taught by anyone who knew more than me, asking basic questions without embarrassment, making elementary mistakes without mortification, because the alternative performing competence you don't have produces nothing, 0. Negative, actually, because it gives you the illusion of progress while preventing any real progress from occurring. The most effective learners I've ever known shared this trait. Not intelligence, though many were intelligent, comfort with not knowing. They could sit in ignorance without it threatening their sense of self. They could ask the stupid question without feeling stupid. That comfort is a skill, and like every other skill we've discussed today, it can be developed. The final truth life, long learner. And now finally we arrive at the last and most important piece. Not a technique, not a method, something deeper. How do you build a mind that sustains the learning impulse? Not for a week, not for a semester, but for a lifetime? Because everything I've described, the Feynman Technique, deep work, spaced repetition, curiosity, ignition, these are tools. They work. But tools require a user who shows up, and the greatest obstacle to lifelong learning is not a lack of good methods. It's a lack of sustained motivation. So how do you keep the fire going? Principle 1, learn to love the process, not the outcome. Most people learn in pursuit of an outcome, the degree, the job, the skill that will get them the promotion. This is perfectly reasonable, and it works for a while. But outcome-based motivation is inherently fragile. When the outcome is achieved, the motivation evaporates. When the outcome seems distant or uncertain, the motivation collapses. When an unexpected obstacle appears between you and the outcome, the motivation often disappears entirely. The learners who sustain their growth over decades, who never stop expanding, who remain genuinely curious into old age, are not primarily motivated by outcomes. They're motivated by the process itself, by the experience of understanding something new, by the feeling of a concept clicking into place, by the pleasure of exploring an idea wherever it leads. I never stopped being curious, because curiosity was never a means to an end for me. It was the end itself. The understanding was the reward. The Nobel Prize was a very nice additional consequence, but it was never the point. If you can learn to find genuine pleasure in the act of understanding, to enjoy the struggle, to relish the confusion, to feel the specific satisfaction of a gap filled and a concept mastered, then you have achieved something more valuable than any specific knowledge you will ever acquire. You have made yourself a permanent learner. Principle 2, build connections across fields. One of the most reliable sources of sustained intellectual motivation is the discovery of unexpected connections between fields. The moment when you realize that the same mathematical structure that describes the oscillation of a pendulum also describes the behavior of electrical circuits, that moment of cross-domain recognition is one of the most pleasurable cognitive experiences available to a human being. I deliberately cultivated this experience throughout my career. I never allowed myself to become purely a physicist in my thinking. I read widely. I talked to biologists, chemists, artists, musicians, philosophers. I was always looking for the places where ideas from one field shed unexpected light on another. And what I found consistently was that the most important breakthroughs in my own thinking and in science generally came at the borders between fields, in the territory that didn't belong exclusively to anyone. If you want to keep your mind growing, resist the pressure to specialize completely. Learn your field deeply, yes, but keep tendrils reaching into other domains. Keep asking, what does this remind me of? Where have I seen this pattern before? What would a biologist say about this physics problem? What would a physicist say about this economic question? The connections are where the magic is. and the connections are always there, waiting to be found. Principle 3, teach constantly. The best way to solidify and extend your own learning is to teach constantly to anyone who will listen. Not because teaching is altruistic, though it is, but because teaching forces you to maintain the kind of clear, gap-free understanding that would otherwise slowly degrade. Every time you explain a concept to someone, you're running it through the Feynman process again, finding the weak spots, rebuilding the connections, sharpening the analogies. And sometimes this happens more often than you'd expect. The act of teaching reveals something genuinely new. A question a student asks sends you down a path you'd never explored. A simple "but why" exposes an assumption you'd never questioned. The teacher learns from the student. I taught throughout my entire career, not just because I was paid to, but because it was one of my most reliable sources of new understanding. The students thought I was giving them something. I was taking something from them too, their fresh perspective, their innocent questions, their inability to accept hand-waving that I had grown comfortable with. If you're not in a position to formally teach, find other ways. Explain what you're learning to friends or family. Write about it, make videos, start a blog, join communities of people exploring the same topics. The act of articulating understanding for an audience, real or imagined, does something to the quality of that understanding that nothing else quite replicates. Principle 4, embrace not. Knowing is a state of being. I want to close with something that might be the most important idea in this entire conversation. The goal of learning is not to reach a state of knowing. The goal is to become increasingly comfortable navigating the vast territory of not knowing with the confidence and skills to transform any piece of that territory into understanding whenever you choose to. The universe is unimaginably large and complex. A single human lifetime, even a very long, very productive, very curious human lifetime, can only illuminate an infinitely tiny corner of it. There will always be more to learn than you have learned. There will always be more mystery than you have resolved. This is not a cause for despair. This is the single most exciting fact about existence. My father gave me something when I was very young that I've carried every day since. He gave me comfort with mystery. He taught me to look at the world and see not a threatening complexity that I might not understand, but an inexhaustible playground of fascinating questions waiting for a curious mind. He used to point at birds and tell me about their behavior without knowing all the names. He'd say, "See that bird? What do you suppose makes it choose that branch? What do you think it's eating? Why do you think it has those colors?" He was modeling something crucial, the practice of turning observation into curiosity, of treating every unknown as an invitation rather than an obstacle. I've tried to do the same. Every time I encounter something I don't understand, which is several times a day, minimum, I try to feel the old familiar excitement. Oh, here is something I don't understand. How wonderful. Let me find out. Not, I should know this, shame and anxiety that closes the mind. Not, I'll never understand this despair that stops the inquiry. Just, how wonderful. Let me find out. The final truth. Everything I've told you today is genuinely useful. The technique, the deep work, the spaced repetition, the curiosity, ignition, use all of it. It works. But the deepest truth, the thing underneath all the techniques, is simpler than any of them. You are already equipped to learn anything, not because you're particularly smart, not because you have access to the right resources or the right teachers or the right school, but because you are a human being. And human beings are, by their fundamental biological nature, the most extraordinary learning machines that have ever existed on this planet. The curiosity is in you. It was there before school tried to redirect it. It's there right now, underneath whatever layers of doubt and discouragement and "I'm not a math person" have accumulated over the years. The method I've given you today is not a way to acquire something you lack. It's a way to recover something you already have, to clear the debris, to reconnect with the natural drive to understand that is your birthright as a member of this extraordinarily curious species. I spent my life in love with the universe and its mysteries. I learned everything I could about everything I could reach. And at the end of it all, looking back at 7 decades of relentless curiosity, I can tell you this with complete confidence. There is nothing more worth doing. Learn something today, learn something tomorrow. Never stop asking why. Never accept "that's just the way it is" as a final answer. Never let anyone, a teacher, a grade, a test score, a childhood label, tell you that you are not capable of understanding. You are. Now go prove it. I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. I'm Richard Feynman, and I'll see you in the next question.